Today we will explore a profession forgotten by time, but one that played a fundamental role in the survival of coastal communities during the medieval era, the seaweed collectors. This documentary will reveal how a seemingly insignificant resource shaped economies, fed populations, and even contributed to scientific discoveries that changed the world. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. The waves break gently against the rocks covered in dark green moss. The wind carries with it the salty aroma of the ocean, mixed with the peculiar smell of decomposing organic matter. It is dawn on a European coast more than 1,000 years ago. A solitary figure emerges from the shadows of early morning, carrying wicker baskets and rudimentary tools. This person is not a fisherman, although they intimately know the secrets of the sea. They are not a farmer, even though their work feeds the plantations of the entire region. This is the seaweed collector, a professional whose importance to medieval communities remains largely unknown to this day. The history of the use of seaweed by human beings dates back to unimaginably ancient times. Archaeological evidence discovered in Monte Verde in southern Chile demonstrates that human populations were already harvesting, preserving and using seaweed as food and medicine approximately 20,000 years ago. This fact becomes even more impressive when we consider that the peoples of the pre-Neolithic period, about 11,500 years ago, were only beginning to store grains on the banks of the Jordan River, 1,000 years before domesticating these plants. Arable agriculture in the United Kingdom, for example, only began 5,000 years ago during the Neolithic period. Thus, the collection of seaweed can be considered one of the oldest economic activities of humanity. In Europe, the first written evidence regarding the use of seaweed dates back to the Romans, whether by the Romans themselves or by the Celtic tribes of Gaul, Brittany, and the British Isles. The ancient Greeks were feeding seaweed to their cattle as early as 100 BC, instinctively recognizing the nutritional value of these marine vegetables. Both Greeks and Romans used certain types of red algae to treat infections by parasitic worms, making this resource invaluable for millions of people who suffered from this type of ailment. Seaweed was also employed as a mordant in the fabric dyeing process, a substance that helps the dye fix to the fibers during the coloring process. But it is in the remote islands of the Orkney archipelago, off the northern coast of Scotland, that we find some of the most fascinating evidence of the ancestral use of seaweed. Skara Brae is a Neolithic settlement built of stone, located in the Bay of Scale on the west coast of mainland, the largest island in the archipelago. Composed of 8 clustered houses, it was occupied approximately between 3280 BC and 2500 BC. Older than Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids of Egypt, this archaeological site is considered the most complete Neolithic village in Europe, having received UNESCO World Heritage status as part of the heart of Neolithic Orkney. Archaeologists who studied Skara Brae for decades were faced with an intriguing mystery. What did the inhabitants burn in their hearths? The archaeologist Gordon Childe initially believed the fuel was peat, but detailed analysis of vegetation patterns suggested that the climatic conditions conducive to the development of thick layers of peat did not exist in that part of Orkney until after Skara Brae had been abandoned. Other possible fuels included driftwood and animal dung. However, there is significant evidence that dried seaweed was widely used as a source of energy. In various sites in Orkney, researchers found a glassy, slag-like material called kelp or cramp, which may be the residue of burned seaweed. Life in Skara Brae 5,000 years ago was marked by creative adaptation to available resources. Orkney was a few degrees warmer at that time, and wild deer and boars roamed the hills. Wild fruits and herbs grew in abundance, and the inhabitants of Skara Brae fed on seabirds and their eggs. There were lakes nearby that provided fresh water, but in a land where trees were scarce, seaweed represented a vital resource not only as fuel, but also as fodder for animals. Recent studies using stable isotope analysis on faunal remains from Skara Brae demonstrated that sheep consumed moderate amounts of seaweed from the time of their introduction to Orkney, a practice that facilitated the successful dissemination of agricultural ways of life into the most remote areas of Europe. Moving forward thousands of years in time, we reach the medieval period proper, when the figure of the seaweed collector emerges as a defined and recognized profession in coastal communities. During the Middle Ages, the seaweed collector was an essential worker in many coastal regions, especially in those with a notable scarcity of usable arable land for agriculture. In these areas, seaweed and fish could constitute the bulk of the population's diet, and seaweed could also be used as fertilizer for the available agricultural lands. In Ireland, seaweed collection was practiced in abundance from the 13th century onwards, with the aim of improving food production by helping crops grow faster. Even today, there is a large seaweed-based fertilizer industry in Ireland and Scotland that helps farmers get the most out of their land. Medieval. Farmers knew that the soil only gave back what was put into it. In addition to marl, a mixture of clay and calcium carbonate, seaweed was used as a valuable fertilizer. Farmers also knew that the best fertilizer was animal manure. However, small farmers could not afford the cost of feeding large numbers of animals, and manure was often scarce. Medieval seaweed collectors developed sophisticated techniques for their activity. Traditionally, they simply harvested seaweed along the coast, collecting species that grew within the tidal zone. This work was carried out mainly during low tides, when extensive stretches of rocks and beaches were exposed, revealing carpets of algae of various colors and textures. Collectors needed to intimately know the tidal cycles, the seasons of the year, and the best locations to find each type of seaweed. Some species were more suitable for food, others for fertilization, and still others for medicinal or industrial uses. An extraordinary archaeological discovery in South Galway Bay revealed the extent and sophistication of the seaweed industry in medieval Ireland. Archaeologist Michael Gibbons and his team discovered a tidal complex that includes middens, cairns, quays, and a seaweed farm from the late Middle Ages. The network along approximately 30 kilometers of coastline suggests a thriving coastal economy over about 7,000 years in the region. The seaweed farm on Orginish Island, below the Burren, on the border between Galway and Clare, is the largest and best preserved of its kind on the entire Irish coast. What makes this discovery particularly notable are the long parallel stone banks placed on the beach to encourage plant growth. Each parallel bank was separated by cart tracks, with the cultivated seaweed crop growing in beds between these tracks. This configuration indicates that Ireland may have been as advanced in seaweed cultivation as Asian countries like Japan and China are today. The cultivated crop was less contested within the community than the wind-blown seaweed along the beach, known as boile d'isteach. Similar complexes have been found in other locations in Ireland, including Achill Sound in County Mayo and Mill Bay in County Down, although none were as well preserved as the one at Orginish. Crossing the North Sea, we arrive at one of the most extraordinary stories related to the use of seaweed, the island of Læsø in Denmark. Situated in the northern part of the Kattegat, the strait that separates the North Sea from the Baltic Sea between Denmark and Sweden, this small island developed a unique architectural tradition that survives to this day. During the Middle Ages, Læsø became famous for its salt industry. The island was practically soaked in salt. The groundwater contained more than 15% salt, and during hot, dry summers, the salt crystallized naturally in large salt meadows. Hundreds of salt kilns were built on the island to refine the product. This thriving industry, however, had a terrible cost for the local environment. The kilns required constant fuel, which was provided by the island's limited forests. A day came when the inhabitants had cut down the last tree. The salt industry eventually went into decline and abandoned the island, leaving behind a population without wood for construction or fuel. It was then that the inhabitants of Læsø demonstrated remarkable creativity. They began to use wood from shipwrecks, which frequently ran aground on the reefs and shoals around the island, to build their houses. And to cover these structures, they turned to the most abundant resource they had at their disposal, seaweed. The species used was known as eelgrass, a marine plant that grew in abundance in the shallow waters around the island. The women of Læsø, often alone while most of the men worked at sea, developed the technique of seaweed thatching and in groups of 40 to 50 people, built roofs that could last 300 years or more. The process involved drying the seaweed, rolling it into thick bundles called vasca, and then weaving them through the rafters to form roofs up to 2 meters thick, weighing between 35 to 40 tons. The reason why these extraordinary roofs lasted so long lies in a crucial chemical property. Both the driftwood and the seaweed were saturated with salt, water. The high salt content made both materials more resistant to rot and weathering. As the roof aged, it solidified into a single mass that was not only waterproof but also fire-resistant and could be stepped on without causing damage. For centuries, the island's inhabitants regularly stood on top of their houses with a telescope, looking across the flat, treeless island for ships caught in storms. Shipwrecks were the only source of wood on Lesu. At the height of this tradition during the 18th century, there were about 250 houses and farms with seaweed roofs on the island. Today, fewer than 20 remain. In the 1920s, a fungal disease decimated much of the eelgrass around the island, causing a decline in this type of roofing. But modern preservation efforts have worked to keep this unique tradition alive. A conservation project supported by Danish foundations allocated millions of kroner for the extensive restoration of the most preservation-worthy houses, which will receive new seaweed roofs. Tourists can now visit the island and observe this very special craftsmanship being practiced. Returning to the European continent and moving forward to the late Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era, we find new uses for seaweed that would transform not only the economy but also science itself. During the modern eras, substances such as crude soda, used in the glass and soap industries, could be extracted from seaweed. This use reached its peak during the American War of Independence, but declined afterward when more efficient sources of soda became available. However, during the Napoleonic Wars, a new discovery boosted the seaweed trade once again. It was discovered that seaweed was a good source of potassium, which could then be used to create saltpeter, which in turn is used to create gunpowder. The production of saltpeter or potassium nitrate was essential for the French war effort. Traditionally, saltpeter was produced using wood ash, but France, like England, was running out of wood, and other sources were desperately needed. Thus, manufacturers turned to seaweed ash, found in abundance along the coasts of Normandy and Brittany. It was in one of these saltpeter-producing factories in France in 1811 that one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 19th century occurred. Bernard Courtois, born in Dijon on February 8, 1777, was the son of a saltpeter manufacturer. Courtois served as a pharmacist in the French army before joining his father's saltpeter business. The British naval blockade against French-occupied continental Europe had created a severe shortage of raw materials for gunpowder, and French chemists were looking for innovative sources of nitrate. On a fateful day in late 1811, Courtois was investigating corrosion in his copper vessels when he added excess sulfuric acid to seaweed ash. To his amazement, enchanting clouds of violet vapor rose, and an irritating odor similar to chlorine permeated the room. When the vapors condensed on cold objects, no liquid was formed. Instead, a quantity of dark crystals appeared with a luster surprisingly similar to that of a metal. Courtois had discovered a completely new element, iodine. Courtois noted that the new substance did not easily form compounds with oxygen or carbon, that it was not decomposed under red heat, and that it combined with hydrogen and phosphorus. He observed that it combined directly with certain metals without effervescence, and that it formed an explosive compound with ammonia. Although these striking properties led him to suspect the presence of a new element, he lacked the self-confidence to undertake a full investigation in his poorly equipped laboratory and was too poor to take time away from his business. Therefore, he asked two friends from Dijon, Charles Bernard Desormes and Nicolas Clément, to continue his research. The discovery was announced to the scientific world in November 1813, 2 years later. The French chemist Joseph-Louis Gay-Lussac studied the substance and named it iode, derived from the Greek word ioides, which means violet-colored. The famous British chemist Humphrey Davy, despite the ongoing Napoleonic wars between Great Britain and France, was granted passports by the French government in recognition of his fame, and also studied the element. Both Davy and Gay-Lussac independently concluded that it was an element analogous to chlorine, and both recognized Bernard Courtois as the true discoverer of iodine. The applications of iodine multiplied rapidly. Just 7 years after Courtois' announcement, a doctor in Switzerland, Jean-François Coindet, discovered that doses of iodine could reduce goiters, indicating that goiter is an iodine deficiency disease, which it indeed is. Rarely, at least before the 20th century, did a chemical discovery have such an immediate impact on medical practice. In 1831, Courtois received 6,000 francs as part of a prize from the French Royal Academy of Sciences for the medicinal value of the element. Unfortunately, he struggled financially for the rest of his life and died on September 27, 1838, at 61 years old, leaving his widow and son without a fortune. Ironically, in his search for a better way to make gunpowder, he had stumbled upon a better way to save lives. Turning our attention to the most recent scientific evidence regarding seaweed consumption in antiquity, researchers from the universities of Glasgow and York published a revolutionary study. They found definitive evidence that seaweed and freshwater aquatic plants were consumed in Europe from the Mesolithic to the early Middle Ages. This suggests that these resources, rarely consumed in Europe today, only became marginal much more recently than previously thought. The researchers examined biomarkers extracted from the dental calculus of 74 individuals from 28 archaeological sites across Europe. The samples revealed direct evidence of the consumption of red, green, or brown algae or freshwater aquatic plants. A sample from Orkney also contained evidence of a brassica, likely sea kale. One of the sites studied was La Corona in Spain, located more than 80 kilometers from the coast. Although 8,000 years ago this location was likely closer to the sea, it would still have been a considerable distance, suggesting that seaweed was an important food source for the people who lived there. But even after the arrival of agriculture in Europe, seaweed seems to have maintained its importance as a food source. The dental calculus from Orkney suggests that people were still consuming seaweed and other aquatic plants, along with meat and dairy, about 4,800 years ago. The fact that seaweed consumption continued into the Neolithic, when it was thought to have been abandoned, strongly suggests that its nutritional benefits were well enough understood for populations to maintain their dietary link with the sea. However, around 2,000 years ago, traces of seaweed consumption seem to have largely disappeared, with most Europeans switching to other plants. Seaweed may have helped feed the first Europeans while agriculture was establishing itself. Chemical traces found in the remains of ancient Europeans suggest that seaweed once provided many of the nutrients and proteins they needed to survive. Historical records complement the archaeological evidence. A text attributed to Saint Columba, who lived between 521 and 597 AD, relates the collection of dulse, a red seaweed, in Scotland. Historical accounts document laws related to seaweed collection in Iceland, Brittany, and Ireland, dating from the 10th century AD. In the United Kingdom, seaweed collection became popular around 1200 AD, and marine vegetables were harvested mainly in Scotland and Ireland. Palmaria, a type of red seaweed actively harvested by the Irish, was given several local names: Dwylisk, Dilisk, Creathnach, and Dulce. The profession of the medieval seaweed collector was much more complex and important than a simple description might suggest. These workers were the guardians of ancestral knowledge that connected their communities to the resources of the sea. They knew which species to harvest in each season, how to dry and preserve the seaweed, and what uses each type of seaweed could have. Some specialized in seaweed for human consumption, others focused on seaweed for animal fodder. Many collected seaweed destined to enrich agricultural soil. The work was arduous and dangerous. Collectors had to work in adverse weather conditions, often exposed to freezing winds and treacherous waves. They needed to intimately know tidal patterns so as not to be caught by the rising water, and they had to carry heavy loads of wet seaweed over long distances. Women often played fundamental roles in this activity, as we saw. In the example of Lesu, where the men were often at sea, It was the women who developed and perfected the seaweed processing techniques. The term vaskepigger, which literally means washing girls, dates from the 17th and 18th centuries. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. The economic importance of seaweed in the Middle Ages is often underestimated. In coastal communities with limited agricultural land, seaweed represented not only a food source, but a true bargaining chip. Collection rights in certain coastal areas were carefully regulated. Some families held hereditary rights over certain collection zones, passed down through generations. These rights were so valuable that they sometimes appeared in legal documents. The transition to the modern era brought new opportunities and challenges for seaweed collectors. The demand for potassium during the Napoleonic Wars created a temporary boom in the industry. But when alternative sources were discovered, many communities that depended on collection saw their livelihood threatened. The discovery of iodine opened new markets, but also led to the industrialization of collection, with large commercial operations replacing individual collectors. However, the heritage of medieval seaweed collectors remains alive in surprising ways. In Ireland and Scotland, the seaweed-based fertilizer industry continues to thrive. In Galway, ancient seaweed farms bear witness to a technical sophistication that rivaled Asian practices. In Denmark, the seaweed-roofed houses of Læsø have become symbols of cultural heritage and examples of sustainable construction. Restoration projects are working to preserve these unique structures, while contemporary architects explore ways to incorporate seaweed-based materials into modern buildings. Iodine, discovered by accident in a French saltpeter factory, has become an indispensable element in modern medicine. It is found in the screen of your cell phone and on your computer monitor. Iodine deficiency affects about 2 billion people and is the leading preventable cause of intellectual disabilities. The story of the medieval seaweed collector is ultimately a story of human adaptation and resilience. It is the story of communities that learn to thrive in challenging environments, taking advantage of resources that other peoples ignored. It is the story of knowledge passed down through generations, of techniques perfected over centuries, of traditions that connected people to the land and the sea. When we walk along a beach today and see seaweed piled up by the tide, we rarely think about the fundamental role this material played in human history. We don't think about the medieval collectors who woke up before dawn to harvest seaweed from slippery rocks. We don't think about the women of Læsø twisting bundles of eelgrass to create roofs that would last 300 years. We don't think about Bernard Courtois watching in wonder as violet vapors rose from his ash vats. But perhaps we should, because the history of seaweed is the history of our own relationship with the natural world. The archaeological remains of Skara Brae, the medieval seaweed farms of Galway, and the seaweed-roofed houses of Læsø remind us that solutions to contemporary challenges can often be found in the knowledge of our ancestors. Medieval seaweed collectors did not have access to modern technology, but they possessed something equally valuable, a deep understanding of their environment and an ability to work with nature instead of against it. The waves continue to break against the coasts of Europe, just as they did 1,000 years ago. Seaweed continues to grow on the rocks and float in the shallow waters, and although the medieval seaweed collectors have long since disappeared, their legacy remains alive in the land they fertilized, in the houses they covered, and in the scientific discoveries they made possible. If this journey through time has sparked your curiosity, we invite you to become part of our community of historical explorers. Subscribe to the channel to follow future expeditions to other medieval crafts and fascinating eras of human history. Leave your comment sharing what surprised you most in this documentary: the seaweed houses that last 300 years, the accidental discovery of iodine, or the Irish seaweed farms that rivaled Asian techniques. Your participation enriches our community. Like this video if you enjoyed this trip to the past, as each like allows us to continue this work of rescuing historical memory. Together, we can ensure that professions like that of the seaweed collectors are not forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you in the next documentary.